Welcome to the Peace Report. I'm Will Griffin. The Pentagon has divided the world up into regional combatant commands, with the latest regional command being Africa Command, or AFRICOM. Since the establishment of AFRICOM in 2008, the presence of the U.S. military has grown exponentially by nearly 2,000%. This military presence is nothing new with the long history of colonialism on the continent, but now, Trump's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has recently announced the administration's new Africa strategy, suggesting a change in policy towards Africa.
And I'm particularly pleased to be here to unveil the Trump administration's new Africa strategy. This strategy is the result of an intensive interagency process and reflects the core tenets of President Trump's foreign policy doctrine. Under our new approach, every decision we make, every policy we pursue, and every dollar of aid we spend will further U.S. priorities in the region.
Joining us today to discuss the new Africa strategy is Netfa Freeman. He is a member of the Coordinating Committee of the organization Black Alliance for Peace, and he is an analyst at the Institute for Policy Studies. Mr. Freeman, welcome back to the Peace Report.
Thank you for having me.
So, AFRICOM has been around for at least 10 years, and the presence of the U.S. military has increased by at least 1,900%. Does Bolton's announcement of a new strategy suggest any of this will change?
No, not at all. I mean, he even alludes to alludes to new relationships firming up or securing the militarization or military operations in Africa. So there's nothing about it that seems to be changing. Aside from now in his speech that he gave in the Heritage Foundation that talks about or outlines it, I haven't really found any documents like an actual plan about it though. But he talks about he alludes to, really implies that they won't be working so much with the United Nations or any other international bodies, and then also which is consistent with the America First thing, and even John Bolton's notorious disdain for like bodies like the United Nations, and then also says, like in the vein of Trump, that they want to get better. He didn't use this language. He uses something that's sort of the same as what Trump says of getting better deals out of the relationships. So other than that, I mean, they admit that. Well, I guess also in it, it just seems to be, really it's the same thing. Aside from those two things, essentially, it's really the same.
So in the new strategy, John Bolton announced 3 core points.
Under our new approach, every decision we make, every policy we pursue, and every dollar of aid we spend will further U.S. priorities in the region. In particular, the strategy addresses 3 core U.S. interests on the continent.
I'm going to go through each point, and I'm going to ask you to respond to each one. The first point that he made is,
first, advancing U.S. trade and commercial ties with nations across the region to the benefit of both the United States and Africa. We want our economic partners in the region to thrive, prosper, and control their own destinies. In America's economic dealings, we ask only for reciprocity, never for subservience.
What's your response to that point?
So actually, it was that part of it in terms of increased trade was the part I was trying to think of that may be different. Previously, or actually historically or traditionally, or whatever you want to call it, the U.S. role in Africa has been more focused on securing the access to raw minerals by corporations and whatnot to extract and then sell back finished goods. And so I'm thinking that's really, he's talking about maybe increasing the dumping of finished products in Africa, which actually destroys the local economies in Africa. And that's a very serious thing. And but that's not new. I guess they're talking about increasing that. They're really in a competition with China and maybe others for what we're calling the new scramble for Africa, because of the global economy shrinking as it is, and Africa really not being any serious player, but mostly just being, stepped on for its raw minerals and access and markets for finished products. But in the last statement where he's talking about we don't ask for subservience and reciprocity, well, that would mean a revolutionary transformation of what the United States relationship has been for Africa from the beginning. Of course, we know that John Bolton is, I mean, these are rhetorical things that all U.S. officials, and it doesn't matter what type of Democrat or Republican, they make these type of rhetorical statements, but we know that essentially and fundamentally speaking, the relationship of African countries to the United States and even to Western European countries has been of subservience. It has been what we call neocolonialism, where they recognize to the extent all the outward trappings of independence, but then continue the same economic and political dominance over that they've been doing. And so that means influencing elections or discarding elections, recognizing them or not because of them being a superpower. It makes a big difference whether they do. It means leveraging of sanctions historically has meant dangling aid in front of them for their own political interests. These are subservient relationships. And then also loans through international financial institutions, which have a lot of strings attached in the form of what are called economic structural adjustment programs. So they're not talking about fundamentally changing any of those, and they definitely don't mean that. But those are the subservient relationships that currently exist. And so the rest is just rhetoric.
All right, the second core point that John Bolton announced in his new Africa strategy plan.
Second, countering the threat from radical Islamic terrorism and violent conflict.
Well, this is also more rhetoric, but we know that there are groups on the ground that can be characterized as Islamic, groups and extremists and violence on the ground. This actually is a product of U.S. policy in Africa, particularly with the destruction of Libya as a country, where it was almost like a hornet's nest of being able to arm and the armory in Libya, and also the extremists were emboldened by their joint operation with NATO to destroy the Libyan Jamahiriya. And so this is actually directly responsible for what we see in terms of the proliferation of Islamic extremist elements and radicalized elements with no real political direction that are all over the continent. So when they say, and has given them the excuse that they needed to even continue and increase AFRICOM. So they do these things, they make these policies and commit these operations that are responsible for the conditions, and then they don't admit that they're responsible for it, but then claim to want to be purveyors of justice around them and solutions to this problem. The propaganda or the media spin around it, or the narrative that's generally a Western narrative, make these people on the outside or even inside the continent thinking that African people are just inferior and we are just prone to be violent, naturally violent, and then we need the benevolent West to come and to police us and to keep us in shape.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a common narrative that much of the world has heard and dealt with before. So point 3 of John Bolton's core 3 points.
And third, we will ensure that U.S. taxpayer dollars for aid are used efficiently and effectively. The United States will no longer provide indiscriminate assistance across the entire continent without focus or prioritization. Under our new Africa strategy, we will target U.S. funding toward key countries and particular strategic objectives.
One, it contradicts the previous thing of not having subservience and all of that. And so it shows, well, one, I think we have to see also through when the rhetoric is put out there, it's also designed to keep us focused on the so-called bipartisan contention between Democrats and Republicans, and not really understand the essential and shared nature and objectives and goals. So when they say no longer, put out aid and those kind of things indiscriminately, it's sort of just an accusation that doesn't make any sense, because these type of aid and different things have always been used as a political leverage to get what they want in certain countries. It's also used in a very disingenuous and inhumane way. You can even look at how they used PEPFAR, which was the Bush administration's aid funding to fight AIDS, which was a political, what you call it, hammer that they used to, whenever they wanted, particularly against countries that they didn't like their policies or were trying to influence or their policies, they would withhold it or also impose certain cultural norms that were adverse to the culture and the traditions of the people, that were more conservative and those kind of things. So this is nothing but a condescending, paternalistic, form of keeping the continent subservient. And so we have to dismiss it, and we have to think about, and then also its aid has always been used to, or has always resulted in the dependence of the continent, the inability of the continent to create and establish our own means of solving our own problems economically, and on also the social problems that we have. And so it's not given unconditionally, which it should be. If people were adhering to the principles of self-determination, you would give aid unconditionally and just let the people figure it out for ourselves. But that's not whatever happens.
So what about the part where he says the U.S. is funding towards key countries? My aspect is mainly focusing on countries that have political structures or leaders that are basically puppets of the U.S. military and the U.S. government. Do you think that's the meaning of them targeting key countries is implying that they're going to empower the people that listen to the U.S. government rather than others who want to chart an independent course for themselves?
Yeah, that's exactly what it means. And we can look at particular countries like Rwanda and Uganda and Niger and Djibouti and those places where they sort of get their way. And not sort of, but they get their way. And so that just means that they're going to be more strategic and how they assert and secure their interests using these more favorable governments.
In developing our strategy, we are revisiting the foundational principles of the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan being the post-World War II era plan to rebuild Europe specifically. What do you make of Bolton connecting the Marshall Plan from the post-World War II era to the new Africa strategy?
It's ironic, I think, because we can't ignore the fact that Africa has been beleaguered with all kind of military destruction and operations and destabilization, and that there are lots of hot spots on the continent. But then the United States is so responsible and so complicit in making this happen. But so in a strange way, it's an acknowledgement that there has been, that Africa is under military assault, but then it's making it seem as if now it's the benevolent one to come and create and solve these problems. It also seems to acknowledge maybe a strategic shift in how they see the success of China, because China's role in Africa, whether we want to, we have to acknowledge that it's doing like countries do, asserting their own political interests or securing their own political interests, but it's been largely about creating infrastructure. And they've been very successful in making a whole lot of inroads all over the continent of Africa, because the leader, particularly in ways that mostly benefit China, right? We even see them bringing their workers and all those kind of things. And this is because we don't have a strong politically independent and revolutionary Africa or even governments on there. So they're largely neo-colonial. They're largely the comprador classes that are running the countries. And so when they make deals with any place, and they also probably prefer China because the U.S., the customary U.S. Relationship is a gangster type one. They come in, and they say, you do this or whatever. And so because of China's history with Africa, both being former colonies fighting against imperialism, now China has emerged and has become a superpower, that it's easier to work with China. Even their rhetoric is about, we're brothers and sisters against colonialism and in the world, even though they're asserting their things. But it's a more it's a more respectful agreements that are made in terms of, and so what Africa needs is to, and I'm going to go back to answering your question. What Africa needs is if we have uh, a leadership instead of a comprador class, neocolonial, that's serving neocolonialism, puppets of neocolonialism. If they could make these same, then the relationship could be beneficial, because then you'd have groups that were actually asserting more mutually beneficial and agreements that could even help the masses of the people, and not just the capitalist concepts of economy and prosperity and those kind of things. You could even do it with China, which is not going to come and hasn't shown to come and invade your country or something if you don't do it right. But I think in terms of what Bolton is asserting is that they are seeing that Africa hadn't, U.S. has not helped in building roads or those kind of things, which China is doing. And so maybe they want to look better. They're not getting ready to give up any kind of, power relationship, I don't think. But I think at least maybe they see that there's something to be gained capitalist wise for engaging in these kind of projects.
I want to dig a little bit deeper because Bolton did address China and Russia, and he said,
great power competitors, namely China and Russia, are rapidly expanding their financial and political influence across Africa. They are deliberately and aggressively targeting their investments in the region to gain a competitive advantage over the United States.
This is kind of basically what you were just saying, but I'm wondering, do you know how Africans on the continent are responding to the Chinese and Russian investments in the continent? Or is it just another form of imperialism?
Oh, yes. And so on the ground, and that's what I was talking about that. Like a lot of the Africans, in terms of the populations, the masses, are very uncomfortable with what's happening with China. Admittedly so, because they're seeing even workers that are taking jobs and those kind of things. So they're not seeing the self-determination aspect, that they're controlling what's happening. And so I'm meeting Africans, and even you see things where people are writing about it on the kind of a concern that the agreements are not mutually beneficial. And so that's a large concern. But at the same time, but it's also, I'm not going to say it's influence or a result of Western propaganda against China, because these are people that understand their real situation, their conditions, and they're talking about what they know and what they're experiencing. But I think there's large concern. Just the short answer, there's a lot of concern about it. And I think what happens because of U.S.'s role as being neocolonialist and sort of more absentee in terms of how it controls, and the puppets of neocolonialism being the front line of what the people face, it was easy sometimes not to think about the U.S. role and to make the immediate target of your anxiety the leadership. Even we see it now. We have to get rid of this president that's been in power too long, this and that. But they don't think about the U.S. role, or even Western European countries' role in supporting this in the neocolonial relationship. But with China, they're right there in your face. You can see them. And so even while it may not be as egregious or what do you call it when you lethal, it may not be as lethal, you can see it, and it's disturbing.
So Africa has a long history of colonialism and imperialism. Can you describe some historical examples of U.S. imperialism on the African continent, like any coup d'etats, interventions, and what impacts have these events had on the continent?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is the classic one that everyone should know about, and that is the U.S. role in the overthrow and the murder of Patrice Lumumba, who was the first democratically elected president of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in 1960, and in installing into power Mobutu Sese Seko, who was in power for like 30 years, consistently doing the U.S. bidding, allowing the U.S. to extract so much from the Congo, and the people really suffered. He was a murderous dictator that they supported for a long time, and even the CIA records show, and a testament from Larry Devlin, I think it was a CIA operative, talking about their role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Also, CIA records come out, and we already knew that the CIA was instrumental in overthrowing Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, the first country to get its independence and decolonize from Britain. And they overthrew Kwame Nkrumah, but he didn't die. I mean, several assassination attempts against several leaders all the time, but then some of them, the assassinations may not have been successful. But then they were able to overthrow the government. So Nkrumah went into exile and lived in Guinea and became actually unprecedented historical thing. Sekou Touré made him co-president of Guinea. But then, so there's that. Then you have operations. There's so many things you could talk about. Liberia, for instance, and their support of Charles Taylor. In fact, Charles Taylor was trained in the United States through, sort of like the School of the Americas does in Latin America. And he came in and overthrew Samuel Doe, and they did the bidding for the United States for a long time and destabilized Western Africa for a long time militarily. You also have Rwanda, both Rwanda and Uganda. They're supporting them right now. Museveni of Uganda, I don't know why I'm blank on his first name, and Kagame in Rwanda. The first names are not coming to me right now, but anyway, they both of those countries, they support them. I think these two countries are the largest recipients of aid in Africa, military aid or just aid. I have to check on that. And they do the work, the dirty work of the United States in the continent, particularly in the continued destabilization of the Congo, and with joint operations with special U.S. forces. They're actually the culprits of over 6 million people being murdered and slaughtered in the Congo between, I think it was 1998 and 2006. And then this still continues today, this destabilization and these murderous operations. And so there's a number of things, and I think we should also remember, which is a different one operation, is that during the time of the independence movements, getting right after Nkrumah, it was a U.S. policy. There's a U.S. memorandum, National Security Memorandum, Special Study Memorandum 201, talks about it was U.S. policy to dump small arms into Africa, and for the purpose of, around that time I remember people were talking about blood diamonds and the different destabilization. You were talking like when the same time there's Samuel Doe and Charles Taylor and those types of the destabilization we saw in the West Africa, even in East Africa. So it was U.S. policy to get rid of arms, and you would see different conflicts in Africa where people are having these sophisticated arms, and no one was asking where they getting the guns from to do these kind of things. It was just a sort of propaganda, making the continent look, inherently brutal toward each other. But that was because there was a U.S. government policy to make sure arms were in Africa, so people could fight each other. What the guy called assisted genocide.
I would agree. So, you just went over a long history, and there's probably plenty of more examples of U.S. imperialism, with examples of coups d'etats and interventions. So usually I think from an American perspective, when people think about these, Latin America is a huge example of history of coups d'etats and taking out political leaders. But I feel like Africa is not mentioned in these circles and these discussions. Why do you think that is, that these examples and historical examples of coups d'etats in Latin America are talked about in U.S. circles, but not about what happened on the continent of Africa?
This is a very good question. And I think my first thinking of it is because, one, if we look at the history of the anti-colonial struggle or the struggle against neocolonialism between Latin America and Africa, we see that there is a 100-year difference. And so while these so if you think about the like the Monroe Doctrine times and all that, where the United States was getting influence and considering Latin America its backyard and was really starting to dominate things. This is like this is like 1900, right? And so, and even before then, the anti-colonial struggle in Latin America was way before. Like we're talking about 17 with Simon Bolivar and all kind of people, and they were able to gain a sort of, if you will, a political maturity in terms of dealing with it. They had a long time of understanding it. So within the continent of Africa, the colonists weren't really able to penetrate the interior of Africa, and the colonial movement, and this is okay. Let me try to make this quick, but talk about some of the what do you call, maybe topographical differences in Latin America. The colonists were pretty much Spain and Portuguese and France, and you had the U.S. coming in later. So, and these colonists were able to assert a cultural dominance in such a way that the languages were important, and that they actually were more. People were either required to either speak French, which is not so many French colonies, but particularly Spanish and Portuguese. And so, and a sort of what you call unintended or counterintuitive thing, it allowed the people to communicate with each other. So in Africa, you still have hundreds of different of thousands of ethnicities and so many colonizers, so many more colonizers. And so the language and the ability to unite was more challenging. And then even once you get the anti-colonial struggle in Africa getting its momentum, we're talking about like 1940s and 1950, where it's actually gaining steam and people were actually able to liberate and get independence and decolonize. But by that time, the U.S. had refined techniques of neocolonialism, of destabilizing and what you call co-opting leaders and bribing them and doing whatever. They had practiced on Latin America in other ways, and so Africa had to deal with a much more refined assault on it in terms of the establishment of neocolonialism. They already knew, well, we can't stop independence and decolonization, but we want to ensure our interests by and they didn't use the term neocolonialism. They didn't use these terms, but we use them because we identify the unfolding and the phenomena as they unfold. But they said, how do we secure our interests, and even in the event in terms of economic and minerals and access, even though we can't stop independence. So these things are universal wherever colonialism has been, and they have been. And if we look at different places, then we can see, depending on where they were in history in terms of combating these things, that also will show you what level of sophistication those who were trying to subject us, keep us subjected, were able to level against the people. So you had, and then also by the time Africa comes along, they just do an all-out assault. They're assassinating leaders. So they were able to really get neocolonialism in Africa. In Latin America, they were able to establish more, even if not revolutionary governments, at least very anti-colonial government, at least anti-Spain, and then fighting against the United States, and be able to build political solidarity movements inside the U.S. So you have a whole bunch of organizations like CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity of the People of El Salvador, and then you have the kind of the white liberals who are embracing what's in the U.S. the injustices in the U.S. backyard of supporting the people's movements there that you don't have them doing on the continent of Africa. And so that latter issue is why it's so much known, because now you have a relationship that's not transcontinental, because it's the same continent, but international, that actually can put out information and keep us a general grounding of history that doesn't exist when it comes to Africa. And then the fact that there's a large population of people of African descent here who really should be the most responsible for carrying the message, for helping us understand what's on the continent of Africa, how our relationship to it. But we experience the same repression that our sisters and brothers on the continent do. So we're really not in a position. We're struggling here too. Although we assert that struggle, we can't really be advanced until we figure out how to integrate the struggles transcontinentally. But we do so much, and they do so much psychologically, to make us believe that our interests are separate or that we're separate in some way. But if once we get rid of that, then we can, and then you see among African people, we do know these things. Those who are in the struggle, who consider ourselves Pan-Africanists, we do know about the Africa and those kind of things in ways that a lot of other people just don't know. But we're a minority, and we're still trying to deal with the conditions of our people internal to here, a lot of political ignorance and whatnot as a result of what we face here. But in terms of how much, like others, liberals or progressives or people who are non-Black or know about it, then that's a struggle. They don't know as much. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Wow, that answers a lot, and I really appreciate that explanation, because I was kind of, and it really solidifies a lot of what I've been doing as a Korean, and showing a lot of Korean and Korean American solidarity organizations that's really been highlighting the issue, and I really think has been pushing the idea of ending the Korean War, which may be a real possibility very, very soon. So so your explanation was really good. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I just want to wrap up with the last question, mainly about U.S. empire. So the common strategy, mainly for forever, has been to invade and do a heavy intervention militarily to countries all around the world. But I feel like recently, since probably the Afghanistan surge with Obama in 2009, the Pentagon has switched its strategy to send troops in to be more of advisors and trainers to the host nation's military on the ground. Is this a sign of U.S. global hegemonic decline?
I don't think so. I think it's actually more a sign of an evolution of neoliberalism. I don't really think it's much different than how we see how neoliberalism in the system sees the utility of bodies, even in factories or on the ground, like employment. So things are automated, and they have less of a need, and it's more costly to employ people and to give them benefits and all these kind of things. So I think we're seeing the same thing when it comes to militarization, the use of drones and the cutting back on troops on the ground. And plus, people don't like to see their people involved. They can actually more accept military quote unquote adventures or operations as long as people ain't dying. And so that's what that's about, and they're figuring out ways to do it. And so even AFRICOM itself is a way to utilize or to exploit the militaries, because these are neocolonialist puppet governments that use those militaries to perform and get what they want, versus putting U.S. citizens in harm's way. But at the same time, it's also hand in hand with the automation of the economy, and I think so we're seeing something that's also a reflection of that.
Yeah, that's well said. So if anybody wants to learn more about AFRICOM or the U.S. military or any African issues, where would you send them?
There's a lot of places. Well, first thing, there's a lot of places, I think, but we should go. Black Agenda Report does a lot of publishing things. There's a woman, Ann Garrison. She does a lot of stuff. Our coordinating, one of our members in Black Alliance for Peace, who's also the director of Friends of the Congo, writes, and his stuff gets published in Black Agenda Report. But even friendsofthecongo.org, people should just visit that. BlackAllianceForPeace.com. We put statements out and analysis, and if you join, you'll get on our listserv, and we'll put out things. The Pambazuka News is a source. They put out progressive stuff. Black Star News is a paper. These are press agencies, sort of, or media, but they put out information a lot. Yeah, I think that's a good start. Yeah.
So we're speaking with Netfa Freeman. He's a coordinating committee member of the organization Black Alliance for Peace, and he is an analyst at the Institute for Policy Studies. Mr. Netfa Freeman, I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for having me. It was good.
For 500 plus, now we need our time back. It's an overdue issue where your human rights at. I hold the line with you, I wanted a pack. I'm some Native American, some white and some black. And I'm proud to be from where I'm at, that's why I'm here. An earth representative and my state of mind's clear. Cause I hail from New York where the state of mind's dear. At this rate in our state today, we're so near.